All right, so this morning, I'm going to kind of pull an audible this morning. I was going to talk about Judas, as we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, but as I've been thinking about the way we speak about Judas and the way that we think about, particularly within Christian thinking of Easter and the death, resurrection of Jesus, sin kind of sits at the top of that, right? Like the way that we tend to have been raised and think about this. So for many of you, you will have been a part of this conversation at least once or twice. And so I really ask for your input, your ideas, your thoughts, the things you've learned over the last few years, especially if you have sat through some of these discussions around this idea. But I want to talk to you about what is a biblical concept of sin? Not what has it become in Western Christianity, but when the Bible talks about sin, what would the people who were reading it in, not necessarily real time, but in contemporary time with the authors, contemporary time with the prophets, when they heard this idea of sin, what would they have understood it to mean? And I think that this is extraordinarily important for us because I think we make some pretty audacious statements and claims about what sin is. And in so doing, we often cause harm to people around us or to ourselves, and maybe even worse to ourselves. So let's first begin. Now, I know some of you know that the very basic definition of sin is to miss the mark. Like that is the biblical definition. Sin is missing the mark. So let's stay away from that very specific definition. But when you hear the idea or the word sin, what are some of the emotions that works up in you? What are some of the definitions or things that conjures up in you? Maybe it's the ways that you were raised to think about it, what you've experienced in religious settings. What does it mean when you hear someone talk about sin?
I think for me, as I was growing up, there was a lot of shame attached to sin.
Yeah, a lot of shame. Anybody else?
Another one is just guilt. Okay, just feelings of guilt, which obviously are attached to shame a lot of times.
Craig mentioned a violation.
If I could comment guilt, because when you get to learn the Bible and you get to learn the difference between right and wrong, before you commit a sin, you think about it, you know what you're about to do, but you still do it anyway. So just to say guilt also.
Guilt, yep, agreed. Yeah. I saw a couple of things flash by on the chat, but I missed them.
Amanda says, everything fun is sinful.
Everything fun is
Wow, yes.
dancing, gambling, drinking. And sex. Yeah. Anybody else? What else? Like, see, Leah says, I was raised to believe that sin is what makes us undeserving of God's love. Oh, yes. And I think that that's a common teaching, but that's a rough one. Anybody else? I don't want to belabor it, but I also want to make sure that we have a chance to because I don't know about you guys, but it was always heavy, right? Like, have you ever had a sermon on sin that you walked out feeling good about yourself? Hopefully, maybe if you heard me talk about it, maybe it was a little bit better.
You know what, growing up, I think there was a overemphasis on sin in the church. It just seemed like that was everything to everybody.
Oh, yeah. yeah, the American Western Christian evangelical church has a sin fetish, very much so, just loves it, can't get enough of it. Anybody else? Part of the reason this came up for me and was something I wanted to discuss was because I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and you know, and we may have touched on this briefly here recently, but when Jesus, I think we talked about it last week, right? Jesus shows up, he walks through the door, and no one's like, oh, thank goodness my sins are forgiven, right? After his resurrection. When Mary Magdalene sees him in the garden, she doesn't go, oh my gosh, Jesus, you're risen from the dead, my sins are forgiven, right? Like that's not the reaction of the people seeing Jesus in that moment, was that their sins were forgiven. Paul says, I was perfect before the Lord according to Torah, right? And we go, well, that's not possible. Because Christianity has done something to this idea of sin that is not biblical. And I think it's really important for us to understand what that is. Any other thoughts or questions before I kind of push towards something? Yeah, Jan.
Well, I know growing up, we didn't dwell on sin like Christians do.
Yes, Jewish faith does not dwell on sin nearly like Christianity. You are 100% correct. Which is there was other things I'm sure that Jewish moms and dads did to make their kids feel guilty and fill them with shame. It just wasn't sin. Right. Yes, it is remarkably a very Western Christian thinking. So I know I keep saying Western Christian, but I think it's really important to emphasize that. It is a unique brand and emphasis in our culture. It's not something, if you went into the Middle East and met Christians in the Middle East, sin is not as pervasive of a concept, idea, and worry for them. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions before we kind of push forward? Yeah.
You know, just popped into my mind is that in the Gospels about the unforgivable sin.
Yeah.
Okay, that I remember a lot of like trauma associated with that in the church.
I had personal trauma with that. I was like, my dad used to do these Bible studies with our family. He would try it like, you know, for 3 weeks and then give up, and then do it again 2 years later for 3 weeks and then give up. But I remember one of them, because, you know, this is the way you lift your family, is you teach on the unforgivable sin. And so me as like a second grader, you know, the unforgivable sin is using the Holy Spirit's name in vain. So I went in, climbed up on my bunk bed, I laid there and I said, Holy Spirit. And then I was like, oh shit, I'm screwed. I'm gonna go to hell. I will never be forgiven for that, and I am gonna go to hell. And I'm not kidding you, for a few years, almost every night, I would pray and say, God, just make this one exception. Just this one time, God. I didn't mean it. It wasn't sincere. And I would wrestle with that. And so, yeah, it causes trauma. All right, any other thoughts before we jump in? All right, so to Janet's point about the difference between Judaism and Christianity is that, so I have a friend who is a Talmudic scholar, which is a really cool type of friend to have. I haven't seen him in several years, but one time him and I were talking, and he said the difference between Christianity and Judaism is that Judaism believes that if you ask forgiveness, you're forgiven, and your plate is wiped clean and you're good to go. As Christians, you perceive that you are sinful And so you will always be sinful. And that you can never be considered perfect in front of God's eyes again. And I thought that that was a really interesting take because it is true. That is kind of the pervasive mindset that a lot of Christians have, which is if you repent, you're forgiven for that. But since you're a sinful person, you're going to sin again. And so you live in that mindset of I'm sinful as opposed to the mindset of I'm forgiven. Right? Even though this time of year around Easter, you'll hear many more Christians say, I'm forgiven. But there's still this pervasive and evasive mindset that exists within Christianity that makes us feel like we are less than, that we are an embarrassment to God, or as Leah kind of mentioned, you know, that it's what keeps us from truly enjoying God's love. So let's talk about what the actual definition is. The actual definition is to miss the mark. And there's something really important here, because I don't think there's many churches that you would go to that they wouldn't say the definition of sin is to miss the mark. But what I think we do and we make a mistake of is we stop short of really investigating what's behind that metaphor. Right? So sinning is actually an archery term for shooting an arrow at a target, and sin is the idea of shooting an arrow and missing it. Okay? So missing a target. So what is absolutely implied in the idea of missing the mark? What do you think? What's implied there that we never talk about or rarely talk about?
That you're trying to hit it.
Yeah, that you're actually trying to hit the target, right? That you're living in such a way that you're attempting to hit a target and you have missed, right? Shaquille O'Neal was the greatest sinner from the free throw line in NBA history. Because that man could barely even hit the rim half the time when he shot. And so he missed the mark. He sinned every time, maybe not every time, but I think like 63% of the time, he missed the basket when he shot a free throw. He's in the Hall of Fame. Okay. This is, I know that, yes, he was a Cavs for a very short period of time, right? But I do want to, I don't necessarily like to make sports analogies, but this was an easy one. In the sense of, here's someone who prolifically missed shots, free throws, missed them, yet is considered in the top 75 NBA players of all time, probably the top 50, top 25, I don't remember where he's currently ranked, of all time. Now, how can someone who is known for that, I believe that until recently, Brett Favre, and again, I apologize for the sports analogies, and I think if you've been here enough, you know I don't do sports analogies. Brett Favre threw like the most interceptions in his career of any other quarterback, which means he missed the mark. He threw to the wrong team, in fact, not even just missed the receiver, he threw it to the opposite team, yet he is also a Hall of Fame quarterback. These are important ideas to think about because the point of athletics, the point of living life, the point of music, the point of art, the point of all these things is not perfection. What is it? If it's not perfection, what is it?
Trying over and over again.
Yeah, practice. Practice? Are we talking about practice? Look at that. That's 3 sports analogies all. And that was Allen Iverson. If anyone wants to. But it is. It's this idea of practice. It's this idea of trying again. You'll hear it often that yeah, I see you. Okay, so Amanda says showing up and trying. Leah says, I think too that all Christians think they have the absolute definition of what the mark is. Yes, that's going to be important for us to discuss as well, Leah. Thank you for bringing that up. This is really important for us because you will often hear people say the goal isn't to be perfect, it's to get better. It's to constantly be improving, right? That each day we go out, we want to live a better day than the day we lived before, right? During the Exodus narrative, right, in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy, just in Torah in general, what do you think the goal was of Moses when taking Israel out of Egypt along with God, right? Israel's pulled out of Egypt. They're in the desert. They're wandering. What is the heart of what Moses is hoping will happen? Yes, we're recording, Amanda. Anybody? Yes.
Basically, to learn how to live under God's rule after living under Pharaoh's rule.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a key point, right? So they had just lived under Pharaoh's rule as oppressed, slaved individuals. They were going to have to spend quite a bit of time figuring out how to be free, right? Have you ever like learned something under someone who was, and oppressive is a strong word, but the teacher was pretty aggressive and really just demanded a very strict set of thinking and doing of something. And that could even be your parents for that matter. And that it took you several years to break out of the chains, so to speak, of that teaching. And that way of thinking about yourself, and that way of thinking about the activity that you were doing, that eventually, when you finally broke free of it, you were able to experience it differently. Can anyone give an example of something like that?
In art,
What's that?
what was the question again?
Like that you were taught a very specific way to do something and it took you a while to kind of break out from doing it the way that you were told by someone. And then you got to experience the freedom of doing it the way that you.
Right, my instructor was very strict. And he wanted things not, well, in his eyes, perfect.
Yeah,
And, if I didn't paint something the way he wanted, he thought in his mind that it should be painted, he would come over and take my brush and show me a different way of doing it.
ugh,
Yeah.
yeah. So have you now you
Uh-huh,
get to paint the way you want?
yeah.
And how long did it take you to kind of break free of still falling back into painting it the way that, or having that running in the back of your head
Mhm.
about how to paint? Did it take a while to kind of break out of that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And, now I haven't been painting for a while, but I'm gonna start painting again. And, he was more, I don't know how to say it. But anyway, I'm painting looser now.
Yep.
I'm just like, just not trying to make something look exactly like what it is.
Yes. Yep. But your impression of it.
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, art is a great example because I myself, as someone who loves to doodle, I was taught very specific ways that I had to approach a piece of art. And it took a long time to kind of develop my own style, is what people say, right? To develop your own style. So anyone else think of any examples? Craig says, I worked at Kroger for 20 plus years, 15 of them under that kind of tyrannical boss. Yeah, and did it take a while for you to trust a new boss? Or to trust that you were good enough, that you didn't need to be, you still don't? That's, anyone that doesn't know, Ton is Craig's direct boss, then yeah, so anyhow. So I think it's important for us to realize that Israel needed a period of time to experience freedom. They had to shed the belief that they were enslaved or that they were only slaves. And it took them a long period of time to understand. And the main goal, I would argue, other than the promised land, and feel free to disagree if you want, but it won't fit my sermon, so you're gonna have to ultimately agree with me, is that, that they wanted the next generation to have it better. And that was the goal. The goal often throughout the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish mindset in ancient times, and I would imagine that's carried forward into modern Judaism as well, was a desire to see that the next generation had it better. And that was the goal. The goal wasn't perfection. The goal was always improving on the past, right? And that's so important for us because I think you and I, for the most part, even if you didn't grow up in a Christian household, have still heard the word sin thrown around just in public, in politics, in TV shows, on the radio, like whatever. We are inundated with this concept of sin, and oftentimes it's not even coming from other religious people. But it's coming from this idea that perfection, anything less than perfection, is failure. Now, if indeed God is referenced in the Bible as mother, father, parent, which one of us would want to either be raised, and maybe you were, I was to many degrees, raised that you had to be perfect, and if not, you were a failure? How many of us would want to raise our children that way? To raise a child up to say, every time you misstep, you are to be reminded of your imperfection. And someday, a collection of these imperfections will be gathered and read back to you. And you will face a punishment for all of these imperfections. Now, that doesn't sound like good parenting. Maybe you have a different perspective than I do, but that doesn't sound like good and healthy parenting. That sounds dangerous and harmful. It sounds like a large amount of counseling bills eventually for someone. But yet that is what we put on God. That is the perspective we have of God, that God is sitting there on a cloud, whatever, and God is taking notes of every decision we make, every action we take, I feel like there's a song in here, like that it is going to be recorded and then we are going to be confronted with it. And then at that moment, God will determine whether or not we are worthy to enter God's presence or be excommunicated permanently. And at some point, we'll have a conversation on heaven and hell here as well. But for right now, I just want to focus on this idea of sin. Any questions or thoughts so far? Does this sound like the God that either you were raised with, and does it sound like the God today that you want to, that you see in the Bible? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm gonna have a comment. Kind of often I have to question everything I've ever learned, ever about this Christianity and whatnot. So there's not like a book of life So like when you get to heaven, like he reads, I'm pretty sure I heard this over the pulpit, that's why I'm asking, it seems so kind of, I don't know how I feel, but there's not like a book or whatever.
So it mentions that there's a book of life that names are being written in, right? But a lot of these things are more so, a lot of our pictures of heaven, our pictures that the Bible give us of the world to come, all of those things are oftentimes, even the creation narratives are counterpoints to other religions of their day and how they imagined the world to come would be. Like Hades was the underworld of the gods, and we call that hell, right? And so Roman religions had different ways, all the different gods had different ways of pronouncing who was considered favored and who wasn't. And so a lot of what Christian writings did and Jewish writings did was untangle these mythos of these other faiths and explain them in a way for Israel to understand and eventually for Christianity to understand. So it's not necessarily that these were meant to be literal as much as they were meant to signify a change in the way that God was to be thought about by the people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I asked that because I'm pretty sure that I was told or taught that everything you do in life is going to be in this book. And it was kind of like try to force you to walk the straight and narrow path. And I always said, I'm just not ready. I can't give up every single thing. When I come time to, I'll try. That's what after you just said everything that you ever did. I'm pretty sure it's over the pulpit. I learned everything you do is going to be written in this book.
Yeah, I think we've all been handed, most of us have been handed that. Yeah, Janet.
I don't know, I don't believe that God is human that sits on
I don't either.
and I more think of God as more of creator of the universe, and you can't see him. And I don't think that, I don't think there's a book that he writes in.
Yes, I hold that same view, Janet.
I now do believe that also.
But I think what happens is, if we lack the language to speak about something, we're only left with metaphor. So we can only speak of God in metaphors. Strong tower, mother hen, many-breasted one. So all of these are terminologies or ways to discuss God that we can't, even saying he is, I don't believe that God has male genitalia, right? And because of that, it's metaphor because we lack language to actually define God. In fact, the text says that God is beyond our ways. And so we use metaphor. So when I said sitting on a throne, I don't actually have God sitting on a throne. I was gonna make a joke about white guy with big white beard too, but I stopped short of that. Someone playing a harp next to him. But I think that that's where we're left, is we can only speak about God metaphorically. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember, that when we're reading the text and these ideas about God, that they're all going to be metaphors because we don't have the ability or the language to speak about God in terms that make sense. Is that fair? Any thoughts about that piece? I know it's a little bit of a segue, but I want to leave room if anyone has any questions or thoughts. Okay, so if sin, what does not keep us out of the world to come, or the Hall of Fame, or whatever, however we want to phrase it, why is sin important? Because I would say it should be the focus that we make it, but it's still important. Why? Yes?
We can learn from it.
Absolutely, that's the perfect response, Janet, because we can learn from it. So sin shouldn't land as guilt. Which should it land as? I'm gonna make some of you maybe uncomfortable here. Encouragement. You should be encouraged when you fall short, because it means that you gave your best shot in this moment, and there's still room for improvement. That you could still do even better if you continue to work at your craft of living. If you continue to do things and participate in the world in a meaningful way, there is still room for improvement. You know, a lot of ultra wealthy people, whether they be actors or other kinds of celebrities or athletes, whatever, business people. So many, such a high percentage of them do self-harm and commit suicide and face severe depression because they feel like they've reached the pinnacle and that there's nothing more to do. And yet they don't feel the happiness that they thought they'd feel. And so if there's nothing left for me to do, in fact, this is what Robin Williams, someone talking about Robin Williams said about him, was that he had achieved everything in his life that he imagined would bring him happiness. And there still wasn't satisfaction and happiness. And he figured, this is already as high as I can get. And so he took his own life. And I think part of it is because we have this perfection mindset, and then we imperfectly determine what's perfect, which is quite ironic, right? We are imperfect judges of perfection. And because of that, we can determine that there's no place left to go but down. I mean, that's a common phrase. You've all heard that, right? Well, there's no place left to go but downhill from here. What a terrible place to be. Yet that's where we often get led from this other perspective of sin, is that if you found yourself achieving and living in such a way that you're at the pinnacle, you think, now what? But sin is meant to encourage us that we still have room to grow. I've used this example many times, and some of you are probably tired of it. But if a child, a 3-year-old, 2-year-old, whatever, takes a box of crayons and you give them a coloring sheet with clearly defined lines, and there's nice thick black lines so it's harder to ride over it, big shapes, and they color it in, and they don't stay within the lines, we hang that on our refrigerator and are proud of that. We look at that and we say, that is beautiful. This is a child attempting to do something beautiful, attempting to express themselves in a way, learning how to use colors, learning how to draw, learning how to do whatever. And we celebrate it, put it up on our refrigerator, and we show it to everyone in the world. And if they're not related to that child, they just shake their head and grin to appease us because they are not impressed by your child's artwork. But this is what I would imagine the divine, God, does with us. That when we are living our life, striving for what is beautiful, striving to play with those colors, striving to do something, create something marvelous, and we present it to God, God does not look at that scribble and say, Don, I can't believe you went outside the lines here. I'm so disappointed in you for putting the wrong color. We all know stems of flowers are not pink. God doesn't look at that attempt of how we color in our life and say, how dare you? But instead, God is proud that we continue to aim at the mark, that we continue to strive to hit what was good and beautiful. Does that make sense? What are your questions, thoughts, disagreements, concerns even, with thinking about it this way? Go ahead, Paul.
So would you say, so like we've been talking about sin in the context of like us trying and missing the mark, but there are definitely people or like times when everybody isn't trying, like we do things that are actually evil things, and we're not attempting to do good. Would you categorize that also as sin, or would you put that in a different thing?
It's not sin unless you're aiming at the mark. You categorized it correctly, Paul. What did you say?
I said it was an evil thing.
Yeah, it's evil. Evil is knowing where the target is and deliberately aiming elsewhere.
Stumbling block, purposely putting a stumbling.
Yes, stumbling block, right? Paul says, don't be a stumbling block, which we also use to abuse people in the church. But he's quoting Leviticus, and Leviticus says, do not curse in the deaf man's ear, and do not put a stumbling block in front of a blind person, because the intention of that stumbling block is to cause someone to fall. So this idea of what you're saying, Paul, is so spot on. We have confused and conflated, made evil and sin synonyms, when in reality, evil is the exact opposite in many ways of sin. Evil is, I know, it's like a bully on the playground picks up the basketball. He knows where the hoop is, and he chucks it to the other side of the schoolyard. Not even, we know, there's no one that goes, oh, he just missed. He was trying to make a basket, he just missed, right? And in that moment, it is evil. And this is the Bible makes differentiation between evil and sin. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that this is also, so then what about the person who isn't familiar with the Bible? Right? What does the text say? Romans particularly addresses this, about someone who doesn't know the Bible. Romans is such a fascinating book to me because people really pick and choose what they teach out of Romans, as opposed to the whole book of Romans. Romans says that if you're not under the law, you can't be held accountable to the law. And therefore, you can't miss the mark. You can't sin if the law doesn't apply to you. So for the Gentiles and the pagans that were not under Torah, they were not accountable to Torah. So therefore, they were not offending God.
What's really interesting about that is I think about the council in Acts 15 is that they made the target much larger instead of much narrower.
Yes. Explain that.
No, I mean, they said that it's even harder for our ancestors to sit under the law. We can't hit the target the way it is. We can't hit it. So why would we make the target that small for the Gentiles who are coming in to the community? We're going to make a larger target for them.
Yes. And I think that this is important, right? So great analogy, Mitch. I hadn't thought about Acts 15 in those ways, and that's really a great connection. Within Acts 15, the argument was that, well, if someone's going to come in, they have to follow all the laws of Torah. So if a Gentile wants to convert to Christianity, which at that time in Acts was still considered Judaism, it was just a sect of Judaism, that if they were going to come in, they had to take on the Torah first, and they had to be circumcised first before they could come in, because in Israel, everyone was circumcised at 8 days old, and so therefore were circumcised immediately. And so the idea was, if you wanted to convert to Judaism, you would have to be circumcised, and you'd have to agree to follow all the laws of Torah. But at the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, the apostles were meeting and they said, wait, is that really what God expects? Now, they weren't dismissing that if you were Jewish, if you were of Jewish descent, if you were an Israelite, that you were circumcised and you followed all the laws of Torah. They weren't dismissing that piece. But what they said was, isn't it enough for them to just agree not to do these 6 to 7 behaviors. And then every Sabbath, they will sit and hear Torah taught, is what it says in Acts 15. They will hear Moses taught in the synagogue every week. And therefore, slowly learn Torah over time and slowly hone their skills at hitting the mark, and that they would slowly then be enveloped in. And I believe that that is the way that you convert to Judaism today. That if you were to convert to Judaism today, it is not as strict as it was in ancient Israel of an expectation, but instead it is this slow, loving, warm process of bringing you in and teaching you along the way. So this is really significant because when we talk about Easter, we look at the resurrection. We look at the death of Jesus and the resurrection and connect it with the forgiveness of sins. And because of that, we end up missing the mark. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more on Easter Sunday. But let me do a thought. I'm going to introduce you to a thought concept that we'll address on Easter Sunday. So, maybe we'll rope you into tuning in on Easter. When Jesus died on the cross, before Jesus died on the cross and was resurrected, do we see any examples of either God or Jesus forgiving people's sins?
There was somebody hanging next to him.
What's that?
When there's somebody hanging next to Jesus,
Yeah, on the cross next to Jesus. What else do we see? Do we see God ever forgive the sins of Israel?
Like a million times.
A million times. Do we ever see Jesus? He forgives the sins of the paralytic that was lowered down through the roof, right? So we see sins being forgiven before the death and resurrection of Jesus. So the forgiveness of sins was never a problem for God. Like God wasn't confounded with how am I ever going to forgive these sins before the death and resurrection of Jesus. Instead, the death and resurrection of Jesus is way more profound than that, which is why when Jesus walks through into the apostles when they're hiding, they don't go, oh, thank goodness our sins are forgiven. Or when Jesus sees Mary Magdalene guarded, she doesn't say, oh, I was so worried my sins weren't forgiven. Now I'm okay. Nobody's reaction was that. Instead, it was that the resurrection was starting. And that the day of resurrection, the era of resurrection, was being started. So, why do you think it's important for us to have this conversation about sin, particularly in the midst of talking about Judas and talking about Easter? Why is it important for us to have a more healthy, theologically sound, biblical understanding of sin?
I have a question, and it's not answering that question. Hopefully nobody gets offended.
Go
I'm
ahead.
serious.
You can.
But I was taught that a person taking their own life was the ultimate sign that you will not be forgiven for that because his best gift was life. If you take your own life, that's like the ultimate sin you will not be forgiven for.
I would say that that's nowhere in Scripture. It's just someone's opinion that became doctrine.
I remembered.
Yes. Why is it important for us to talk about sin? Yes.
I think it's what our ultimate pursuit in life is all about. Okay, is our pursuit about avoiding sin, or is our pursuit about pursuing God?
Yes. That's such a great statement, Mitch. You should have been teaching this morning. You've made a couple of great ones. Between you and Leah, you guys have owned it. What's really important here is for many of us, because of this way that we were raised to think about sin and fear sin, we walk with trepidation. What does the Psalms say that how we're supposed to move? Anyone? I can walk with confidence because I hold the hand of God, and though I stumble, I will not fall headlong. Do you remember that one? That's the Don paraphrase. Another Don paraphrase says, the Lord directs the steps of those that delight in God. Yet we spend so much of our life afraid of messing up that we don't trust that our steps are directed, that God is holding our hand, and that we can run with reckless abandon because we don't have to live in fear of falling headlong. We don't have to live in fear of falling out of favor of God because God holds our hand. This is a beautiful metaphor to me. And instead, what we've done is made a whole group of people, an entire several generations of Christians, live in fear and trepidation of disappointing God. Now, I'm doing a couple errors here that I hate doing, and forgive me when we call this lazy teaching. I've made several sports analogies, which I hate from the pulpit. And I've made a couple parent analogies that I hate from the pulpit. But I'm gonna make one more parent analogy, just to balance out the two things I hate. Is if Malcolm, my son, who is 18 now, in order to avoid ever disappointing me, just locked himself in his bedroom, so as to never, ever make a mistake. That wouldn't work. That would not work. Yet, for many of us, our Christian faith we have, or just our faith in general, we have locked ourselves in our metaphorical bedrooms out of fear that if we go out, we will only disappoint God. I want you to know that that doesn't fit the text. I think about Jonathan and his armor bearer. The Philistines are sitting across the way, and there's one sword in all of Israel. And Jonathan looks at his armor bearer and says, I'm going over into the Philistine camp in the middle of the night with this one sword. Do you want to go with me? And then to really sell it, says, and maybe God will go too. You know, I want to talk about a opposite of a memorable halftime speech. See, there you go, another sports analogy. I'm just getting them all out for the whole year. Let's go over there. We have one sword. The entire Philistine army's there. You can come as my armor bearer. I don't know what he was carrying because there was only one sword. So just tagging along for the fun of it. And God might go with us. Which means that Jonathan wasn't certain that that was what God had in mind. But Jonathan was willing to run with reckless abandon because he believed this was the right thing to do. And guess what? If God had not gone with Jonathan over to the Philistine, I don't know if it still would have been recorded. If he had not done that, God had not done that, and the Philistines would not have been scared off, Jonathan still would have been remembered for doing the right thing, for attempting to save the lives of the Israelites. And I think this is important for us because I think we become immobilized, paralyzed, apathy begins to set in, to bring full circle to something Mitch said earlier. Apathy starts to set in, and atrophy even starts to set in of our muscles, of being able to move and function in a way that brings beauty and love to the world. Because we're spending too much time looking at the sin of how we missed the mark, instead of saying how much more if I continue to practice, if I continue to show up, if I continue to fire away at life, that I will continue to get better and improve. And so sin is a reminder of how much further we can go. And it's what Paul says, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That was meant to be encouraging. All have sinned, all have missed the bullseye and fallen short. The only thing that is perfect is the glory of God at the very center. Every single one of us have fired off a shot that has missed that mark. And we take that and make that condemning, guilt-ridden, and instead it's encouraging. It is why I believe, though I disagree with Bonhoeffer on Luther's idea of go and sin boldly, right? But Luther said, go and sin boldly. Practice the compassion and mercy of God. And though I disagree with some of his connotations from that, it plays into this mindset of sinning boldly means that you are just going to take your shot. Yes, Mitch.
No, you know what popped into my mind when you were talking is it's the parable of the talents.
Yes.
To me, that's exactly what Jesus is teaching about. Okay, so the person with the one talent basically learned how to fear, buried it, didn't do anything with it. And I really feel like the whole teaching of that is like you just said, sin boldly.
Yep. Craig just says Mitch thinks he's all original.
Because Paul said it in the chat.
Oh, did Paul say that in the chat? Mitch isn't looking at the chat. Good job, Paul. Good job, Mitch. Well, that's good, because I'm glad that you guys are making, this is the beauty that I love about this community. And I want to encourage you, is that the ability to connect the Bible in multiple ways is what empowers us to improve our aim. That ability to see this story one place and then see it again someplace else and see it again somewhere else, that ability to connect these stories in the Bible, it will help you improve your shot and will help you to improve the way that you're living. Yes.
Now, I have a question about this. Why do we do this as Christians? I mean, I have my own philosophy behind this. It's like we have to have some people who are out and some people who are in. We have this, I think it's a dysfunction. It's that bounded set that we cannot, we have to have people on the outside and people on the inside. We can't deal with it otherwise.
Well, I think it goes to quote oh my gosh, what's the movie, the Pixar movie with the superheroes?
Incredibles.
The Incredibles. To quote the Incredibles, if everyone's special, then nobody's special. And I know other places have said that. And I think what happened was that within Christianity specifically, the idea of being holy was set apart, right? That's just a term. And the Israelites believe the same thing, right? Set apart, being set apart. And so this idea began to infiltrate that this part is that if everyone is in, then no one's set apart. Yet God says, I delay because I desire that nobody perish, right? God's desire is that everyone's in. Yet from the pulpit and from the church, we want people to be out because that makes us holy. Oh my gosh. And that's the danger. It's why people cringe and they say, well, what happens if you misinterpret the Bible or you interpret the Bible? Well, lots of things could happen. Some could be good because you're just using, I've said this to people before, that's a biblical concept, but the wrong passage, right? Like you might be saying, interpreting this passage in a way that I go, that's not what that passage is getting at, but that's a biblical concept. Here's a better passage to use for that perspective. Or we could cause harm to other people But the moment that we cause harm should be the indicator that we need to reevaluate the way that we read. Because love causes no harm. And so if what we're teaching from the Bible, if what we're learning from the Bible, if what we're understanding from the Bible causes harm, that is a really good red flag for you to understand that it is not sound. That doesn't mean it's completely false what you're learning or what you're hearing or what you're reading. It's that there is something that you're not fully understanding in it. You need to take a deep breath. You need to cut yourself a break. You need to recognize that love causes no harm. And if love causes no harm, then if you are experiencing harm from the pulpit, if you're experiencing harm from religious leaders, if you're experiencing harm from books that you're reading or the way that you yourself are reading the text, that is a red flag, and we need to step back and reevaluate. All right, any other questions or thoughts this morning? Craig, it looks like you have something to say. I feel like I want to hear whatever's going through your head right now.
Your thumb went up. Your Zoom thumb went up.
I thumbed up. Got it. And here I thought it was profound. I love you, Craig. It probably was profound. He probably lied. He probably had something else there. All right. Well, what other thoughts or questions do you have? I would say we have a couple more moments that we can talk about this, or we can wrap it up. Did I miss anything in chat?
A couple things here and there. Too late. You have it up there.
I can look up.
Well,
Yeah, Janet, go ahead.
this has nothing to do, well, kind of, a little bit has to do with today, but this is, I think it's from from the New Testament.
Okay.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. For all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths.
Yes, so that is actually from the psalm that I was talking about.
Uh,
Yep, so that if you love God with all your heart, then God will direct your path. Yep, it's from the Psalms. Yep.
That's from the Psalms?
Mhm.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I believe it's somewhere between Psalm 27 and Psalm 34, I think. Forgive me for not knowing right offhand. So Paul said he had heard that unironically from the pulpit. I'm assuming if no one's special, I'm guessing that's the Incredibles quote. And then he says in Romans, Paul says, what then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? By no means. I'm not sure how to understand that with also having a positive view of sin as encouragement. Yeah, so what I think is being said here, Paul, so great question. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? So he's talking about to the Gentiles who, because they haven't taken on Torah yet, because we have to remember that anytime Paul talks about law, he's talking about Torah. And we need to shed the anti-Judaism thinking that law is bad. And what he's saying is that as a Gentile, you're not under Torah. And he's saying, so then should you then not worry about improving your aim because you're not required to follow all the laws of Torah? And because you just are under this time of grace while you're learning Torah. And then he says, by no means. So his point here is just because, let me liken it to this if I can, and Paul, tell me if it's garbage, because it might be, because it's off the top of my head at the moment. Is I liken it to a diplomat in another country who has diplomatic immunity. They don't need to follow those laws. Does that mean that they should just run red lights, abuse the people around them? We've seen that happen in those settings. But just because you have the right, you have diplomatic immunity in another country, doesn't mean you should not honor the law, even though you're not under that law. You should still respect the space that you're in. And so he is telling Gentiles to make sure that when you walk into a synagogue, you treat it with the honor and respect it deserves, even though you're under grace and not under Torah at this point. Is that helpful, Paul? Okay, don't leave your thumb up too long, you'll get the thumbs up on the screen. Okay, so I don't know that that's necessarily like super encouraging, but I think it's actually wise advice. Any other thoughts? Paul, I love your input every week. It's been delightful having your ideas and stuff. I hope you feel encouraged to continue doing so. All right, any other questions or thoughts? All right, well then let me pray over us, and then we'll stop the recording and we'll do prayer requests. Lord, you are so good. I'm so grateful for the opportunity that you lay out before all of us to improve, to live in community, to learn better how to care for each other, care for those around us, to create a welcoming and loving place for people to come and feel loved, cared for, heard, seen. Lord, may we continue to sharpen our skills of living a beautiful, loving, compassionate life. May we continue to be a people that strive to improve our aim. May we be a people that continue to encourage one another to improve our aim. Lord, I love you. I thank you for your mercy. I thank you for your compassion. I'm so grateful that you hang the artwork of our lives on that divine refrigerator in the sky. Lord, may we be a people that do the same for those around us. I love you. I praise you. I give you all the glory.